Last year I preached a sermon here on poetically dwelling on the earth as a mortal. That sermon was preached in honor of my favorite undergraduate philosophy professor, James Edwards. Dr. Edwards was the most well-known, articulate, and matter-of-fact atheist who was a professor at my college. And suffice it to say that in the late 1990s in South Carolina, there were pretty few out atheists. I had a few good friends in high school that were self-professed agnostics, but Dr. Edwards was, if not the first atheist that I knew well, then certainly the first atheist that I met who made atheism seem like a serious, well-considered worldview that a healthy, thoughtful, compassionate adult might choose. A decade after I first met Dr. Edwards, the climate for atheism in the United States began to shift. In 2004, Sam Harris published The End of Faith: Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason, which became a major New York Times bestseller. 2 years later saw another major bestseller with Richard Dawkins's The God Delusion. That same year, Daniel Dennett published Breaking the Spell: Religion as a Natural Phenomenon. Another major atheistic bestseller appeared in 2007, Christopher Hitchens's God is Not Great: How Religion Poisons Everything. There are other important representatives of the contemporary atheism movement, but in particular, Harris, Dawkins, Dennett, who I've heard referred together as Ditchkins, and the now late Christopher Hitchens have been jokingly referred to as the four horsemen of the non-apocalypse. I should probably also hasten to add that what is most significant about these so-called new atheists is not anything particularly original about their ideas. Their ideas are, for the most part, contemporary updates of perspectives that can be traced through more than 2,000 years of freethinkers in various cultures. Rather, what is new and significant is a growing public interest in atheist arguments, creating multiple major popular bestsellers about atheism in our country and around the world. As a result, many individuals and groups are feeling more emboldened to privately and to publicly question traditional religious claims. One symbol of this shift is a large scarlet letter A. Now that's playing on Hawthorne's scarlet letter, but here in the 21st century, it's meant not to mark the shameful A of adultery, as it was centuries ago, but a proud A of atheism. Where then do we find ourselves a decade after, in the year 2014, a decade after Harris's first book, which started this unexpected trend in popular best-selling books on atheism? In October 2013, the Pew Research Center reported that 2.4% of American adults say they are atheists when asked about their religious identity. That's up to 2.4% from 1.6% in 2007. Importantly, though, what self-identified atheists mean by that self-label of atheist is not always clear, and it varies. For instance, 14% of those who say they are atheists also say they believe in God, or a universal spirit. My personal best guess at explaining that particular discrepancy is that these poll respondents are saying that they are an atheist in regard to disbelieving the God of traditional theism, who, to be frank, sounds a lot like an old bearded white man up in the sky, a lot like Santa Claus or Zeus. Looking down at us like a family circus cartoon. At the same time, those 14% of atheists do potentially believe in God as a universal spirit. For similar reasons, many UUs feel more comfortable substituting the word God for words like spirit of life, spirit of love and mystery, or simply the sacred or the divine. The Pew poll results continues with some further statistics that I actually see as hopeful for the future of Unitarian Universalism. It says, quote, not all atheists see a contradiction between atheism and spirituality. A quarter of atheists say they think of themselves as spiritual people, and 3% consider themselves religious people. 4 in 10 atheists say that they often think about the meaning and the purpose of life, one of the things that Unitarian Universalism cares about deeply. And among atheists, 82% say that they either often or sometimes feel a deep connection with nature or the earth. So we can sign them up for cups, right? Now, we sometimes call this perspective, in all seriousness, religious humanism, which emphasizes awe and respect for this life and for this world, over concerns about any afterlife or religious traditions which can seem obsolete in light of 21st century knowledge. Now, presumably in response to these burgeoning numbers of out atheists in the U.S., a significant inclusion back in 2009 in President Obama's first inaugural address was the president saying, quote, "Our patchwork heritage is a strength, not a weakness. We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers." In contrast to that traditional formulation of the U.S. as a Judeo-Christian nation, President Obama's choice of words in his inaugural address recognized both our nation's growing religious pluralism, Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, as well as an increasing numbers of, quote, non-believers. In recent years, related practice in some progressive Christian circles has been atheism for Lent, giving up God for Lent. Not to be confused with L-I-N-T, what you find in your belly button or your dryer. This is Lent, L-E-N-T, from the Old English lectern, which means springtime, and it's from the old Anglo-Saxon word for lengthen, as in the lengthening of days. That's when Lent happens, as the days are growing longer. In the Christian liturgical calendar, Lent refers to those 40 days leading up to Easter Sunday, in which the period of daylight is lengthening, leading up to spring. And that 40-day period of Lent is traditionally a time of self-discipline, self-examination, and spiritual practices in preparation for the celebration of Easter, and in imitation of the 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness being tempted and tested prior to his baptism at the beginning of his public ministry. Atheism for Lent is a sort of postmodern variation on that tradition, in which a group of people work through a collection of 40 reflections over the days of Lent, made up of some of the greatest and most perceptive criticisms and critiques of God, of religion, and of faith, in an effort to clear away false beliefs in preparation for a more honest and a more authentic celebration of renewal at Easter. And contrary to many popular conceptions of Christianity, the spiritual practice of doubt is central to the Christian tradition. To name only the most prominent example, according to Mark, the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels, Jesus cried out during his crucifixion, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Indeed, the poignance of these words from Jesus is underscored by them not being rendered in the language of common Greek, as is most of the Christian scripture, given that it was written in the Greco-Roman Empire, but it was instead written in Aramaic, the language that a Jewish peasant such as the historical Jesus would have spoken. Mark 15:34 explicitly says that Jesus said, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," and then it translates it, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And that existential cry of doubt is at the heart of the Christian tradition, even if it's not always presented that way. And despite the important role of doubt in the Christian tradition, if you're curious about what it might feel like to experiment with atheism for Lent, now I know some of you experiment with atheism every day, but let's set that aside for now. I would not, to be honest, recommend that you turn first to the New Atheists. Although their books are popular bestsellers in recent years, the opinion of both myself and of many commentators is that as a whole, most of the New Atheists are, to be frank, strident, arrogant, mean-spirited, and dismissive, not only of religious fundamentalists, which I share in criticizing, but also to anyone who seeks to carve out any sort of nuanced middle ground related to religion, such as that in which Unitarian Universalism seeks to inherit. And to be fair, I can sympathize with their approach in part, because many New Atheists feel embattled from so many years of cultural dominance by Christian supremacists. That's right, Christian supremacists, who want the U.S. to be a Christian nation in a very exclusivistic way. Nevertheless, I find the tone of the new atheist to be in many ways an unhelpful form of reactionary secular fundamentalism, a fundamentalism of its own. And as I have said before, my own proclivities lie in the middle ground of seeking to draw from both religion and science, humanism and mysticism. Moreover, in the words of John Hott, a senior religion professor at Georgetown University who specializes at the intersection of religion and science, and who for many years taught a course on the problem of God, has said, the recent books by Dawkins, by Harris, by Hitchens, those would never have made the required reading list for my course. Their tirades would simply reinforce students' ignorance, not only of religion, but I would say also of atheism. Hott calls them proponents of soft-core atheism because their work is so bland and shallow compared to the landmark criticisms of the late 19th and early 20th century of hardcore atheists like Karl Marx, Frederick Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. Long before Harris and Dawkins and Dennett and Hawken and Hitchens were deemed the four horsemen of the non-apocalypse, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud were known as the masters of suspicion, referring to a way of interpreting texts and people's behavior with a highly skeptical approach that seeks to unmask and dig up underlying biases and unconscious motivations. And although a small library could easily be filled with books that have been written by each of these masters of suspicion, the following is an attempt to distill the core of their basic critiques. Marx sees religion as the sigh of the economically depressed, the sigh of the economically distressed, that primarily serves to legitimate the current unequal distribution of socioeconomic power. So for Marx, we need to unmask that underneath the religion impulse, it's really about our dissatisfaction with an unfair economic playing field. And we don't think we can do anything about that, so we placate ourselves by being religious. And that in naming the ways that religion is merely, as he said, an opiate of the masses, we can free ourselves to focus on creating a fair economic system if we reject that opiate of religion. In his famous words, that would allow the workers of the world to unite and occupy Wall Street. Okay, I added that last one. The second master of suspicion is Nietzsche. He sees religion as the resentment of the weak against the strong. That the weak can't control or compete with the strong, so they convince the strong to be religious and play on the weak's playing field. So we need to unmask, according to Nietzsche, the ways that religion is holding back the greatest among us from achieving their fullest potential and overcoming the limitations that traditional morality puts on them and preventing them from becoming what he called the Übermensch, the Superman, the beyond human, self-actualized. Finally, Freud sees religion as an existential weakness seeking consolation. Put more boldly, Freud sees the root of religion as a desire for your mommy. That the felt longing for the presence of God is really about the unconscious desire to return to that oceanic feeling of the womb. But each of these three renowned masters of suspicion, and there's much more to say about all of them, they each owe a tremendous debt to an earlier and much less well-known atheist professor of religion named Ludwig Feuerbach. How many of you have heard of Feuerbach or know anything about him? Exactly, so very few of you. Who's heard of Marx and Freud and Nietzsche, right? Okay. Feuerbach, not as well known. But Frederick Engels, Marx's famous collaborator, said, after Feuerbach, we all became Feuerbachians. More than, I know, right? Anyway, apparently not. More than 150 years before the first of today's new atheists broke onto the New York Times bestseller list, Feuerbach's 1841 book, The Essence of Christianity, quickly became a public sensation in the German-speaking world. And fascinatingly, just as a brief side note, the English translation of Feuerbach's book was done by George Eliot, who, of course, wrote the classic Middlemarch, and is a woman, if you're not clear on that. George Eliot was the pen name. As one historian of religion puts it, Feuerbach argued that all statements that theologians make about God are in actual fact statements about human nature. In a word, or really two words, they are psychological projections. Put in the form of one of Feuerbach's most famous refrains, the true sense of theology is anthropology. All claims made about God are in actual fact reflections or projections of man, or humans. Thus, Feuerbach provocatively proposed that the key to unlocking or unmasking the underlying truth of the human religious impulse was to reverse subject and predicate. To reverse subject and predicate. Hashtag grammar nerds, if you're still with me. So to reverse the subject and predicate of traditional religious claims in order to reverse and claim for ourselves those unconscious truths that we had formerly projected onto the divine. So he writes that if Jewish scripture states that God made humans in God's own image, what this really means is that man made God in man's image. Or if Christianity states that God is love, what it really means is that love is God. We projected that onto God to realize that truth, and now we need to claim it for ourselves in the fullness of adult religion. To use a Feuerbachian lens to interpret that parable that you heard earlier, when the atheist heard God say, "Dear friend, I don't exist," that voice was his own projection, is what Feuerbach would say, of what he most deeply needed to hear, heard, said, which in turn freed him from its unhealthy complex, to use a Freudian term, this unhealthy fixation and obsession with disproving arguments for the existence of God. And that allowed him to then free him, after that unmasking of what religion was really about, to dedicate his remaining years to serving the poor. So this connection between theology and anthropology is one of the reasons that the classic UU curriculum, Building Your Own Theology, it starts not with studying traditional religions and theologies of the past. That comes later in the 10-week course. It starts, Feuerbachian style, with autobiography, with anthropology, with becoming more conscious of how much your life story, your firsthand experience affects and shapes and instructs how you do theology. Again, in Feuerbach's words, the true sense of theology is anthropology. All claims about God are in actual fact reflections or projections of humanity. Now, you may or may not agree with all this, but I think the place to confront these things is in religious communities, and that I think we do ourselves and our young people a disservice when the first time they hear things like this is in college. We send them away from home and they hear stuff like this for the first time. That's unhelpful. At the same time, just as there is nothing new under the sun with the new atheist, there's a sense in which the basic Feuerbachian insight was expressed at least as early as the ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophers. More than 2,500 years ago, the philosopher Xenophanes noted that it was no coincidence that, quote, the Ethiopians worship black gods and the Thracians worship gods with blue eyes and red hair. You want to guess who had the black skin with the black gods and the blue eyes? And that the gods looked like them. And that, quote, if oxen, horses, and lions had religion and hands, they would no doubt paint their gods to look like oxen, horses, and lions. The dangerous contemporary corollary, of course, is that when individuals and groups take their psychological biases that they have projected onto God, when they take those projections literally and use them as a sacred mandate to turn their misogyny, their racism, and their homophobia into what they view as divinely ordained sexist, racist, and heterosexist laws, you get the situation of what Tippy talked about in Utah. Or as one Christian theologian has sharply put it, we transform that sacred covenant formula, I will be your God and you will be my people, we transform that into a vehicle for making God our personal property. This can happen at the national as well as the denominational level. Thus, as an example, Iran, Israel, and the U.S. respectively represent Islamic, Jewish, and Christian versions of what could be called possessive monotheism. Possessive monotheism, thinking that there's one God and that one God belongs to you. At least in the practices of some of their most devoutly religious citizens. We thus become a definition of the good. We become a definition of the good in that scenario, and the saved. And we make those who differ from us into the wicked and the lost. And if we are among those who preside at sacramental rites, like myself, of our faith, we become the dispensers in that scenario or the withholders of divine favor. And that's a tremendously dangerous position to be in. As I said last week in regard to the need for evolutionary religion, there are many compelling reasons and appropriate times to take ancient theologies seriously, to take them metaphorically, to take them archetypally. But we often go awry when flat earth metaphors and theories are taken literally. That's when people get burned at the stake. That's when books get burned. But here's where it gets really interesting. At least, I think so. Feuerbach says further that, quote, what today is atheism, tomorrow will be religion. What today is atheism, tomorrow will be religion. And I think what he means is precisely parallel to what many progressive practitioners of religion are seeking through the practice of atheism for Lent. One theologian calls it the religious uses of modern atheism. The religious uses of modern atheism. Uprooting the unconscious self-deceptions of religious traditions. In other words, rejecting the false idolatries that atheism lightly exposes can ironically lead to a more mature understanding and experience of God or Spirit. God or Spirit. Those are human words in human language. Remember those respondents in the Pew Research poll who both identified as atheists and also believe in God or a universal spirit? A legitimate question is therefore, what understanding of God, of spirit, or of theism are you rejecting with your atheism? One political theologian puts it this way: the new atheist must choose what God is it that they're attacking. Is it the God of the mystics? Is it the God of the followers of the social gospel, the 18th century deists, the God of the Quakers, the God of the liberation theologians, or the stern God of the patriarchs? Are they at war with Thomas Aquinas or John Calvin? Or are they at war with Mohandas Gandhi, Thomas Merton, or Paul Tillich? As one contemporary philosopher says about his work that seeks to take the criticisms of the hardcore atheists very seriously, he says, quote, I am trying to open thinking and practice to the event that is playing itself out underneath the word God. I am trying to open thinking and practice to the event, to the verb-like thing that is playing itself out under that noun word, God. This year, Lent begins on Ash Wednesday, March 5th. So you've got 2 weeks to prepare yourself. If you want to explore more in depth as a group with this whole Atheism for Lent, there's actually an online course. I'll link to it if you're really interested in these things. But as Unitarian Universalists, let me say that our fourth principle calls us to a free and a responsible search for truth and meaning. Free and responsible. If you're drawn toward theism, toward the spirit of life, toward what we mean when we talk about the sacred or the divine, if you're drawn to that, I invite you to continue to reflect on what it might mean for you to experiment with the spiritual practice of doubt. If you are drawn toward atheism, what might it mean for you to open your thinking and practice to the event that is playing itself out under the word God? Let us continue to reflect on what it means to pursue a free and a responsible search for truth and meaning in light of all that we know in the 21st century. As we continue that reflection, I invite you to stand as we sing together hymn number 293, O Star of Truth.